These two 20th century postcards are of one of Beijing's most famous landmarks, Zhengyangmen, the gate of the Zenith Sun. These postcards would have been purchased by Western visitors to Beijing who would have sent them back to their friends and family back home. In the 1910s, the decade that these postcards were made, Beijing was undergoing a fundamental transformation. The last Chinese dynasty, the Qing dynasty, had just collapsed, and the city was undergoing rapid modernization. The two towers that are shown in the postcards are only the surviving remnants of the original Gate of the Zenith Sun. A few years prior to these postcards' manufacture, the rest of the gate had been demolished in the name of progress. Fortunately, because the gate was one of Beijing's most famous landmarks, there are plenty of old photographs of what the gate used to look like. Using these old photographs, I want to tell the story of the history of the Gate of the Zenith Sun, from its construction in the early 15th century right up till the present. But before we explore the history of the gate, we must first understand its significance within the city planning of Beijing. Beijing was constructed during the Ming dynasty between the years 1406 and 1420. The city had been conceived by the Yongle Emperor as the most magnificent city the world had ever seen. But its beauty was not for everyone to see. Access inside was highly restricted, with these stone walls separating Beijing from the outside world. To get inside, one would have to have permission to pass through one of the city's 9 gates. The 9 gates were evenly distributed along the 4 sides of the 22.5-kilometre long perimeter wall, but it was the southern gate that faced in the auspicious south direction and that was aligned along the city's central axis that was considered the main entrance. Unsurprising for such an important gate, it has played a central role in Beijing's history. At different times, it has been seen as a symbol of the emperor's power, as an instrument of ethnic segregation, as a battle zone, as Beijing's main transportation hub, and as a relic to a bygone era. The gate is a window through which we can witness the evolution of Beijing over the course of 600 years. This is the story of Zhengyangmen, the gate of the Zenith Sun. The gate's function was to offer passage through the virtually insurmountable 15-metre high wall that fortified the original Beijing city. The gate itself was not simply a door, rather it was a barbican made up of 4 fortified gateways, each of which was topped by a defensive tower. The interior gateway, which led directly into the inner city, was completed first in 1421. The entrance was built into the perimeter wall itself, and its defence tower was made out of wood. Prior to the construction of the Barbican's outer 3 gateways, it went by the name of the Beautiful Gate, the same name as the southern gate of the preceding Yuan dynasty's capital city. The 3 exterior gateways, which were built into protruding rampart walls, were added later in 1439, at which time the Barbican adopted its final name, the Gate of the Zenith Sun. These rampart walls further enhanced the entrance's defences, and soldiers could also use the ramparts to access the towers above each gate. The design and function of these gates, like every aspect of Beijing, was hierarchical. The southern gate was to be used exclusively by the emperor. In accordance with its superior status, it was topped with an imposing stone defensive archery tower, from which projectiles could be fired in the event of an attack. In contrast, the east and west side gates were guarded by comparatively modest defence towers. These inferior gateways were to be used by everyone aside from the emperor. This even applied to the leaders of other regions who sought an audience with the emperor, such as the Dalai Lama, who entered the city through the eastern side gate in 1908. Inside the confines of the rampart walls could be found two temples. To the west was a Taoist temple to the venerated ancient Chinese general Guan Yu. And to the east sat a temple to the Buddhist goddess of mercy, Guan Yin. These temples were custom at all of the city's entrances to be visited when passing through the gates. The emperor would only use the gate when he left the capital to travel south, most commonly to worship at the Temple of Heaven and the Altar of Agriculture that lay several kilometers outside the city. Originally, the area south of the gate was outside of the city limits, but during the Ming dynasty in the year 1553, the outer city was built and officially incorporated into the city of Beijing. Concurrent with the outer city's construction, the central axis was also extended south to the Gate of Eternal Stability. Originally only a single entrance, the gate later expanded with a barbican and an archery tower in 1767. Yet, the gate did not have a gateway reserved solely for the emperor, a sign of its lesser importance compared to the other structures on the central axis. The reason for the gate's lower rank was that it only entered into the somewhat inferior outer city. The lesser status of this southern city was made more distinct after the fall of the Ming dynasty in 1644. The invading non-Chinese Manchu people who captured Beijing and proclaimed it the capital of the new Qing dynasty forced all of the conquered ethnic Chinese to live in the outer city. Over time, this ethnic segregation resulted in the southern city being recognized as the Chinese city, whereas the northern section became known as the Tartar city, referring to the Manchu people that inhabited it. The Gate of the Zenith Sun offered passage through the city wall that divided the two races, and thus it became one of the only points in Beijing where the two groups could cross paths. Therefore, in addition to being the defensive and ceremonial gate that it was in the Ming dynasty, during the Qing dynasty it also became a point of intersection between the ruling Manchu people and the subjugated Chinese people. Before long, the street in front of the gate developed into a bustling commercial area, where the industrious Chinese provided goods and services for the Manchus who crossed into the Chinese city daily. A distinctive, decorated archway was erected above the road to indicate the street's significance, and it became known throughout Beijing for its new nickname, the Front Gate Street. The Gate of the Zenith Sun had experienced several unfortunate fires across its long history, after each of which it was routinely repaired. Yet the fire of 1849 came just after the Qing dynasty's coffers had been drained by reparations paid to Great Britain after the First Opium War. Consequently, to rebuild the Tower Gate, the Qing government resorted to scavenging wood from the temples of the Garden of the Carefree Spring, one of the 5 imperial gardens that lay to the northwest of Beijing. The First Opium War was just one of a series of military defeats that the Qing dynasty suffered during the 19th century, many of which were perpetrated by what were previously considered inferior barbarian nations, such as Great Britain and Japan. With defeat came humiliation and financial distress, which in turn led to anti-foreign sentiment, a hatred that by the turn of the 20th century gave rise to the Boxers, a militia dedicated to driving foreigners out of China. With tacit support from the Qing dynasty itself, the Boxers entered Beijing and proceeded to lay siege to the foreign diplomatic quarter that was located to the northeast of the gate. To save their citizens from slaughter, 8 nations united together to invade Beijing and quash the Boxer Rebellion. The British headed the assault on the city at the gate of the Zenith Sun. In order to fully support their troops in combat, the British required an efficient supply line. To this end, they demolished a section of the outer city wall just east of the Gate of Eternal Stability, so that they could build a train line within the city. The train tracks were built along the east perimeter of the Chinese city, right up to the Gate of the Zenith Sun. The gate itself was guarded by the Chinese Muslim Gansu army, who fiercely defended it with their lives. The British eventually overcame them with their superior firepower, in the process bombarding the gate with artillery that resulted in its almost total annihilation. The 8-nation alliance was ultimately victorious and imposed the Boxer Protocol upon the severely weakened Qing dynasty. One of its many terms stipulated that the Qing could not rebuild a tower at the destroyed Gate of the Zenith Sun. Therefore, a simple decorated archway was erected instead. And yet, given the symbolic importance of the gate, many Chinese still yearned for it to be rebuilt. And so, starting in 1902, provinces throughout China began donating funds for its reconstruction. But the designs for the gate had been lost, and the authorities had no photographs of the original available to them. Thus, the gate upon completion in 1906 varied noticeably from the original, with the roof of the interior tower slightly steeper, and the size of the southern archery tower a little bit taller. The ad hoc train line that the British had built in 1900 ultimately became permanent. The Chinese Emperor and Empress Dowager, who had fled Beijing during the 8-nation alliance invasion for fear of being captured, actually returned to the capital in January 1902 along the tracks that the British had built. Over the coming decade, the route was converted into a commercial line connecting Beijing to Fengtian in China's northeast, an area rich in natural resources. A large European-style train station was built just east of the Gate of the Zenith Sun to serve as its terminal. A second station was also built to the gate's west, serving the Beijing to Wuhan line. After the Boxer Rebellion, foreign nations continued to increase their presence in the city, so they could protect their subjects, as well as their assorted interests in the country, such as these newly built train lines from Beijing. This led to a redevelopment of the legation quarter, which had been virtually flattened during the Boxer Rebellion. To the northeast of the Gate of the Zenith Sun, on the opposite side of the city wall from the east train station, lay the United States Legation Headquarters. It consisted of both a diplomatic mission and also an army barracks, the latter of which was enlarged several times. with a second barracks being built in 1918. Because of their close proximity to the gate, the Americans would often parade in front of it and scale the wall to scout the surrounding area. The gate itself was also used as a backdrop in many of their group photos. In the year 1912, the Qing dynasty collapsed and was replaced by the Republic of China. Overnight, Beijing's imperial architecture that existed to legitimize the emperor's rule became obsolete. No longer would the gate of the Zenith Sun be required to regulate who could enter the city, nor was it necessary to have a separate gate reserved solely for the emperor. With no significant purpose, the side gates and rampart walls began to be seen as a nuisance that obstructed traffic. Thus, in 1915, the decision was made to remove the Barbicane side gates and walls and cut 4 semicircular tunnels into the inner city wall to the east and west of the gate, to allow smooth passage between the north and the south of the city. In one fell swoop, the gate was transformed completely. Gone were the days that it symbolized the emperor's power and authority. Instead, the remaining north and south gateways would remain as an acknowledgement of the city's past and as an embodiment of the new Beijing's ability to reinvent itself, of its capability to adapt and absorb the old architecture into the new modern city. Indeed, the front archery tower went on to become more closely incorporated with the business district in front of the gate. In 1928, it was given a new life as the headquarters of the National Production Protection Bureau, which was created to protect domestic production. The Bureau's location acted to further boost the front gate street's economic profile, which has lasting effects till this day. The disembodied arrow tower, juxtaposed against the modern city around it, went on to become one of Beijing's most recognizable landmarks. This, combined with its central position in Beijing, meant that many different groups chose to march past it when they wanted to make a strong political point. Agitated citizens chose to congregate there to protest against the increasing influence and control of colonial powers over China in the 1930s. The Japanese, who launched a full-out invasion of China in 1937, passed the gate during their parade into the city. And after the Chinese Communist Party captured Beijing during the Chinese Civil War in 1949, they also organized a victory procession that passed the gate. Throughout these events, the Arrow Tower was repurposed multiple times, becoming first a police office and then later a cinema during the Japanese occupation, before finally becoming a garrison for the People's Liberation Army after 1949. The northern gateway, although still standing, gradually faded from the public consciousness, eclipsed by its more prominent counterpart to the south. Both the north and south gateway towers of the Gate of the Zenith Sun were heavily damaged during the Tangshan earthquake of 1976, but after being extensively repaired, they are now open to the public. During Imperial China, if one were to enter Beijing through the Gate of the Zenith Sun and continue travelling north along the city's central axis, they would come across what is today perhaps the most famous structure in the whole of China, Tiananmen, the Gate of Heavenly Peace. Yet, whilst Tiananmen may be more well known internationally today, during Imperial China it would have been the Gate of the Zenith Sun which served as the main entrance into the imperial capital, which would have been more recognizable in the eyes of the Chinese. Moreover, compared to Tiananmen, the Gate of the Zenith Sun has played a more central role in many of the key events which occurred in Beijing over the past 600 years.